When you're working with quite large sets of data, it's quite common to need to group categories of data into larger or higher groups. And it's very easy to do that within Power BI Desktop straight from within a visual. Let me show you how that works. I've got a simple report here. I'm just looking at this chart on the right-hand side that's showing me revenue by different product segments. And let's say I wanted to group two of these things together to view them as one category across these different segments. All I need to do is select the points that I'm interested in. So let's say I wanted to group the convenience and productivity segments. Hold down Control and click on both of those. And now when I right-click, I'll see this option to group those two categories together. You'll see now they get identified with a different color, and we've got a different groups field that's been put into the legend of this chart. You can see that something else has been added to the field list here. I have this segment groups item. And that's what we're then putting into this legend. So I can see the convenience and productivity piece, things have been identified separately. Now I can go and use that field anywhere else in any of the other visuals in my report. So if I wanted to take a look at this revenue by manufacturer and split this between those two groups, convenience and productivity or other, all I do is grab that groups field, drag it into the legend, and now that's been split in those two ways. So those two things have been grouped together here. If I wanted to show a bar chart here with all of the convenience items and productivity items as one bar, and then another bar for the others, I'd need to swap the two fields over so I can see those two things broken down. What that's actually created behind the scenes is a separate column in this data set that identifies which of these two groups any of these segments belong to. And I can come into to the menu here and actually edit these groups as well. And this dialog box gives me a list of all of the values that exist in my segment column, and then all of the groups and the different items within those groups. So you can see the two things that I selected, which were convenience and productivity, have been put into a group together. And then we have this other group, which contains all of the other values that haven't been put into a different group. And that means that if you refresh this data and new items appear in this ungrouped values list, they'll all go into that other bucket as well. I can do things like renaming these fields. So these might be our new products or new segments. I can create new groups as well. I can do all of the, I can manage these here. So I can select more things in this ungrouped area, group them together, and this is our new one. So this is our classic segment. And I can add things to the existing groups as well. If I select a group on the right-hand side and then choose to add it over into that other group, I can do that here too. This little tick box allows me to choose whether or not this other group is shown. If I don't show that, it means that all season, regular, and youth will be shown as their own items within that list. When I tick it, they'll just appear under a group called Other. So now if I hit OK, that will get updated, and you'll see all of those visuals using that field get updated. So the coloring is going to change in this right-hand chart, and here the segmentation across each of these bars gets updated. So that's grouping on a categorical field. I can also do something called binning, which is very similar but operates over continuous fields like numbers or dates. So rather than looking here, for example, I've got a unit sales by date. Rather than looking at across every single date in my model, I could come to my date field and choose a new group from here. And I get the same sort of dialog, slightly different options here. I'm actually now binning these dates into larger buckets. We'll actually try and choose some fairly optimal kind of sizes of bins by default, but you can go and customize these as well. So for example, let's say I wanted to group that into 3-month bins. So this would give me like one item per quarter in my data. When I hit OK, this will now go and create another column in my data. You can see my date bins. And now when I drag that onto my axis, let's make that a column chart that might be a little easier to see. You can see my date is now split up into 3-month buckets. So this is from January 2014, from April 2014, July, October, etc. So I've created another level of grouping on top of that underlying date column. And I can do the same thing for numbers as well. Let's create another chart, and let's make this one let's look at our product revenue on the axis and the number of units that we sold on the value. So I can see that most of our sales, we have lots of sales coming from fairly low revenue transactions, but there's a couple of very high outliers. This is quite spiky. There's quite a kind of rough distribution here, but I might want to reduce some of the noise in this kind of histogram, if you will, by grouping, or rather by binning along this revenue field. So I'm going to come in, choose a new group here. And again, I get the same sort of dialog. I can choose the size of the bins. I can choose how big we want to make each of these bins. Or I can also choose the number of bins. And again, we'll run some standard kind of algorithms to figure out how many bins would be optimal for your data, given the distribution of the values within it. But I can go and override that. So if I wanted 50 equally sized bins, that will create a new column for me. And if I put this onto my axis, you can see we smooth out some of that jagged items in those histograms. And I can see much more clearly kind of the size, the relative number of transactions for each revenue group. So that's a really simple way of making your analysis a little bit clearer, trying to reduce some of the noise in that data, or splitting up your values into different groups and different segments as you're trying to do that analysis.